So here's where we left off in the last lesson, and we're just about finished with this. And what we need to do now is render this out so we can save this image or a video if we have an animation in our scene. So let's get right into it. Let's go to our render setup, and this will bring up our render setup dialog box. And there are several options that we can choose from here, but what we're going to do is we're just going to stick into the common tab, and we're going to discuss just a few sections inside of this tab, just the most important, so you can just get a basic understanding of rendering. So in our time output, we have single, active time segment, range, and frames. And what this is asking us is, are we wanting to save just a single image, or are we wanting to save an animation? Okay, so single is for images. Active time segment, it will render out every single frame on this timeline from 0 to 100. A range will render out a specific range on the timeline that you've specified. So I could do 50 to 100 if I want, and it'll just render out from frame 50 to 100. Or I could adjust, or I could render out the frames or specific frames. So in this case, by default, it's going to render out frame 1, skip frame 2, render out frame 3, skip frame 4, and render out 5 through 12. Okay? Now, the next most important section is the output size. Now, whenever we are rendering out an image, let's say it's just got a lot going on, we've got tons of materials and tons of lights, you may want to try and stick to maybe a smaller image size, especially if your computer is unable to handle the extensive amount of rendering memory that it's going to need. So if you're ready for the final image, then you could go ahead and render out the exact size that you're looking for, a high resolution size. So in this case, there's not very much going on, so I'm just going to stick with the 800 by 600. Now let's go ahead and move on down to our render output. And what I've got here is, this is where we can actually save our render output. So let's click on Files, and you'll see here that it's going to go to a default location called Render Output. And this is where our renders are going to be saved. You can specify where this saves if you would like, but I'm just going to keep this in my default location. And I'm going to go ahead and call this still_life.jpg. Okay? Now, we do want to make sure that we are giving it a file name, and we are also giving it a type in which to be saved. So if we want a video type, if we're doing an animation, we could choose from AVI, we could do an MOV if we need to. But in this case, we're just doing a single image, so we're just going to stick with JPEG. Okay? Now, once we hit save on this, it might bring up a dialog box saying, okay, you know, what's the quality of this JPEG image you want to use? So you might take the quality all the way up, you might take the quality to halfway, and then you would just hit OK from there. Okay? So once you have that finished, it hasn't actually rendered anything out yet. So it will go ahead and save that image once we hit the render button. So let's go ahead and hit render here. And you'll notice that this is rendering out multiple frames here. And what has happened is, let me go ahead and close this. What has happened is I left this on frames and I didn't change this back to single. So instead of one single frame, I now have several JPEG images in that location. So let's go ahead and go back to single, and let's go ahead and just render that. And that's going to render a single frame here. Now you'll notice that this composition is not exactly the best. I've just got a lot of empty space that could be filled up with my main part of my composition. So I'm going to show you a quick little tool that we have available to us to really help us with composition. So let's go to our perspective, and let's just click on that. And you'll notice that we have the show safe frames. So we're going to check that, and you'll notice that this really sizes down and we get this yellow box here. And basically what is inside this yellow box is what's going to be rendered. So let's go ahead and zoom in here, and let's really size up our subject inside of this yellow box here. So now if we hit render, it's going to go ahead and ask us, do you want to overwrite? We're going to hit yes. And now you can see that our subject is more of the picture rather than just that white space. Okay? So let's go ahead and close this out. And we've been using the default scanline renderer. Okay? You may have heard about using something called Mental Ray, or if you're really new to 3ds Max, you may have heard of iRay. But we might want to go ahead and change that rendering engine just to figure out what those rendering engines actually are. So to do that, we can go to Assign Renderer, and you'll notice that we have in the production, we have default scanline renderer by default. Okay? So if we want to choose a different one, we just hit this Choose Renderer button, and here we have our list. We're just going to use the Mental Ray renderer just for right now, and we're going to hit OK. So now whenever we hit render, we're going to overwrite this. You'll see that this is rendering in a different way. It's kind of taking squares and rendering those squares. Now you'll also notice a difference in the quality of the render as well. We've actually got light and color bleed bouncing off of our different surfaces. So you'll see here we have this kind of a darker orange, almost like a red color. That's because we actually have light that's bouncing off of this surface and applying itself to this surface. This is called color bleed. And we'll also have a little bit of color bleed coming off the surface of our table onto our geometry as well. Okay, so Mental Ray can give you a lot of different options, and it can actually give you more materials to work with and more options in your lighting to work with as well. Now you could really get a grasp of Mental Ray by going to our Introduction to Mental Ray in 3ds Max lessons, or that entire course inside of our library. Alright, so let's go ahead and close this render out. And in this lesson, we've really taken a look at how we can render objects in our scene. And that really wraps up our beginner's guide to 3ds Max. Now from here, if you want to learn more about 3ds Max, Digital Tutors has several different training courses that you can go through at this point. A good place to start would be Introduction to 3ds Max. In this course, we go through a more in-depth look at modeling, rigging, animation, texturing, and rendering. After that, you can go through Introduction to Modeling in 3ds Max, where in this course, we go through several of the most commonly used tools for modeling in 3ds Max. After that, you can go into more advanced topics such as rigging and animation. So if you enjoyed the course and want to learn more, make sure you check out all of the additional courses we have available at digitaltutors.com.